Welcome to the Health Tech Edge, the podcast on how technology is reshaping healthcare operations. I'm Mike Moore. Today's topic is a big one. Healthcare has gotten really good at discovering new treatments, precision medicine, targeted therapies, AI driven drug development, billions of dollars going into it. But patients still struggle to actually access those treatments. So the question is why, and what would it take to fix it? To help us unpack that, I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Carter, founder and CEO of Medzown. She's been working at the intersection of precision medicine, data, and patient care for over 20 years, including founding N of one of the early leaders in precision oncology. Jen, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Mike. Happy to be here.
So let's start with your story. You've been in this space for a long time. What led you to focus specifically on the problem of access to these new and developing treatments and therapies?
Yes, it started a long time ago. My story began a long time ago and was really inspired by a number of friends and family members who were diagnosed with really bad cancers. I'm a physician by training and practiced for a while, but then ended up doing some consulting and doing some work in financial services and for startups, and was got very interested in cancer drug development and diagnostics. But when these friends got sick, I was very involved in helping them navigate their journeys. And they were people who, got to the major cancer centers and saw some of the best physicians out there, but they would go to different places and be told completely different things. And there was sort of no underlying way for them to actually sort through that information and figure out what was the right treatment strategy for them. I call this the swirl. And I think we
Mhm.
all understand that experience as a patient or having a loved one, a friend, someone who's been through a very complex disease journey, that they go from doctor to doctor or center to center and be told different things and get different testing and in trial and error medicine. And it's really frustrating. It runs up a lot of cost and it leads really to worse outcomes. And what I saw was, I really saw this fragmentation in the system. And then at that time, which was back really in the early 2000s, the field of molecular diagnostics was really just beginning. And the field of these new targeted therapies and immunotherapies for oncology was just beginning. But if people were already going through this, before this kind of esoteric new type of medicine that was based on sort of the deep data of genetics and genomics and proteomics was available, it seemed to me it was gonna get that much harder because doctors really weren't trained in that. We had maybe a couple of genetics or sessions during med school, but that was about it. And so how are patients gonna get access if the doctors really didn't have that cutting edge information at their fingertips?
Yeah, and that's quite the challenge, right? Because we do so much to try to train doctors. I mean, it's famous kind of how lengthy of an education doctors go through before they are really kind of on their own in front of patients, and obviously, learning and kind of especially many teaching hospitals. But ultimately, having the latest science, right? So you've got private industries working on all kinds of research with billions being spent in that space, and then ultimately, yes, it's kind of that missing link is the matchmaking to try to match the patient with the right treatment therapy that might even be experimental or a clinical trial, right? So these
Right.
are things that still could be in the pipeline and not widely known and used, but could be the answer to saving their life.
Absolutely. We've seen that. I've seen that for years. In fact, my first company, N of One, as you mentioned, we started that back in 2008. And at that time, one of the biggest challenges, as we were just talking about, was how do you use that information, right? How do you use genomic information to design treatment strategies for patients, the precise treatment strategy based on the data and the knowledge around what was driving their tumor? With all these new drugs, targeted therapies, et cetera, all those drugs at that time were in development. The only way really for patients to get access to them were in clinical trials. And if you look at what's happened over the last 15 years in oncology, it's been this sort of massive change in the way that patients with cancer get treated. It's not to say that the old therapies, like many of the chemotherapies, are still terrific drugs that work for patients, but targeted therapies, immunotherapies have really changed the paradigm. And we understand now how many sort of sub-diseases each kind of cancer type, each organ of origin really is made up of, and how that's driven by this molecular biology. And so at that time, the real challenge was how do you turn that data into knowledge that could be used to design these treatment strategies so that physicians knew how to use that information. And as we've seen over the last decade or more and more of these fantastic drugs based on genetics and genomics and understanding of genomic biology, including CAR T cells and cell and gene therapy and many more types of therapies have really the opportunity for them has really grown beyond cancer to rare disease, neurodegenerative disease, and autoimmune disease. And still, like back then, so many of those drugs for patients really aren't yet approved. And the only way for people to get access to them is really through clinical trials.
And maybe, and this is obviously with what you're doing today in MedZone, that you're creating certainly kind of a matchmaking opportunity. Is that right? Essentially, what you're trying to do.
Well, it's sort of broader than that in the sense of we really take a precision medicine approach to really understanding the complex biology of each person's disease and many other variables around their clinical profile and personal profiles, and really be able to try to help them and their physicians have the data to be able to make decisions and get access to cutting edge treatments. So part of it is really, kind of that deep domain expertise, understanding the data, and then part of it is kind of a first and last mile to help close the gap between kind of the understanding and the knowledge about the treatments and the sort of availability of them in some context or other, and helping the patients and their physicians really drive access to those so patients can get those treatments.
So, how do patients get access to this set of services that you offer?
Right. Well, thanks. We actually work with health plans to come in as a benefit for patients or the members of the health plan and basically provide the knowledge, the domain expertise, and the first and last mile to create that type of offering for the members so they can get access to those cutting edge treatments. We work closely with them and their physicians. The provider is an important part of that. And, our task is really to enable both the provider and the patient to have that information, have the knowledge, and have the access to cutting edge treatments.
So it's different than even having a second opinion, right? That the patient is, going and they're working with their doctor, but you're coming in as a value add to the insurance plan in many cases, as you say, to try to provide some additional information, context, and helpful. But ultimately, you still have to partner with that physician, the oncologist, or whoever it happens to be, right? That's working directly with the patient. How does that partnership play out?
Right. Well, it's always it's always a balance of how the process is driven through the system. And again, I think the difference is in a second opinion, there is another physician who's providing their opinion on what the best approach for that individual is. Our goal is actually to provide the information and the opportunity, knowledge around what is available to the patient based on their particular disease. And however that leads to the next step and the next action is where we're involved to really support that process.
I have to imagine that physicians are a little caught off guard, right? Because services like what you offer are relatively new in the industry. Or, I mean, you've been doing this for 20 years, but I think I'm hearing about it more. I'm seeing more of it in kind of the industry. What is their reaction in terms of how they partner with an organization like yours and kind of any resistance, or how do you overcome it if you do?
Yeah, I think it's really part of our design is, it's again very different than coming in and telling physicians what to do. So we really look at ourselves as truly an enabler of teeing up the data, making the physician more efficient, driving their ability to practice cutting edge medicine or even offer cutting edge treatments to their patients. And so I think in many cases, physicians have, very little extra time. They have to see a lot of patients. They're under a lot of financial pressure. And these patients are very complex patients. And so, for the majority of physicians and the majority of patients out there, they are back to back to back all day. And being able to have that data and the access for their patients, that's really streamlined, that's efficient and effective is a tremendous value add to their practices. So we've been getting really positive responses related to that. And I think, we come in as non-threatening and we're not looking to replace the physician. It's really an adjunct to what they're able to provide to make it more of a team and collaborative effort to get the patients the right access.
Yeah, and ultimately, they're especially when you talk about cancers, they and their patients are in a race against time. right? So it's, every cancer, and some are more aggressive and depends on when it's caught. And, we all know about kind of the
Absolutely.
stages and those kind of things. But I have to imagine that that sense of urgency isn't lost on them. And if there's additional data and, the world of clinical trials and all the therapies and treatments that are available in the world, right? The world has gotten a lot smaller
Correct.
over the last 20, 30 years, where things that they might have heard about or seen at a conference could be on the other side of the world at this point, but that could be incredibly relevant to what they and their patient are trying to deal with, right?
That's right. I mean, this system is incredibly fragmented, as you know, and one hospital system and one practice can't possibly offer the range of necessary treatments or trials or developments to every single patient, right? And that's kind of the interesting thing about precision medicine, right? It used to be that we would think of these disease categories as someone had lung cancer or breast cancer or pancreatic cancer. And now we know that there are multiple subtypes of these cancers, right? And so there's so many different treatment options and different treatments in development. There are thousands of these specialty drugs that are in development for so many different diseases. At any one physician, any one practice, any one hospital center cannot offer all the possibilities for every single patient that might walk in the door. But the access to that knowledge, the access to those treatments is incredibly fragmented, and the data to bring it all together doesn't really exist. So it's so hard for patients and physicians to be able to know what's out there and even how to get access to it. It's a very big challenge. The system is really not designed well for managing very complex diseases or even sometimes less complex diseases as well.
And I know just, being here in Boston where I am, with some really fantastic hospitals and cancer centers and research facilities, I think there's a lot of pressure, right? We're about to have the Boston Marathon this month here in Boston. There are friends of mine who for years have run for Dana-Farber or other kind of, the
Correct.
Jimmy
Yep.
Fund, kind of associated organizations. There's so much fundraising to fund research, to fund clinical trials or fund all these things. I think there's a lot of, and there are centers like this around the country and around the world where there's so much pressure and people really feel and it pulls at their heart because everyone has had someone in their life, that's been affected by cancer. But maybe this helps us get those research dollars to perform a little bit better as well because we're opening up access and a broader audience. Because I have to imagine, clinical trials, obviously the nature of it is you're trying to get patients in to test the drug therapy or whatever it happens to be, right? And kind of figure out if this works for this thing that you've designed it for. The more participation, the more data, the more insights and hopefully success of those things, then they get kind of, submit to, if it's here in the US, go through the FDA, right? Get approval and become broadly used, get out of trial and into broad implementation, right? So there's got to be kind of a economies of scale, I guess, is kind of the point of my babbling here that we get to with all of this.
Absolutely, and that's a huge goal, right? I mean, you wanna really drive efficiency of the whole process, right? And it's super important for the patients, and getting back to your point about a lot of these patients don't have a lot of time, right? Whether it's cancer or a degenerative disease or a complex rare disease, many of these folks do not have time, and it is a complex system, and we wanna drive these new treatments forward, right? Again, getting back to when I started N of one, the transition from that time period when most of the current, really many of the, I should say, many of the current really transformative therapies in cancer, or now we're looking at the gene therapies or CAR T therapies. When we look at those, they didn't exist 15 years ago. And now many of those diseases were either have turned into chronic diseases or have brought close to cure. People are in remission for long periods of time when they weren't before. So the goal is how do we get more of those treatments out there more quickly? And it also allows us to create a more sustainable system where patients are getting the right treatments more quickly as opposed to getting more wrong treatment or the trial and error approach of let's try this, but let's really get into the data. Let's really understand people's disease and really get them on the right treatment as soon as possible in the course of their disease.
And there's a world out there that does genetics from a kind of a pre-disease screening, somewhat kind of prediction model too. You're not in that space, right? But do you have a perspective on that and kind of how that's used in kind of predictive diagnostics or whatever the right term would be?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, Medzone's, Medzone, we're really working with patients after they've already been diagnosed Although, of course, there's an important role for many of the tests that, there's sort of the predictive or, the early detection type tests, which I think, Mike, you're referring to, but they're also the minimal residual disease tests as well, to be able to follow patients who may be in remission, who may not have kind of measurable disease still, but to be able to pick up whether they're recurring earlier or not. And some of those tests have proven out to be quite valuable and useful in earlier detection of recurrence. They're also the tests that are trying to, predict or to predict people's risk or detect earlier on whether or not someone may have a cancer. The data on those is still evolving, but of course that will be very powerful because prevention or, early detection is obviously would be a very valuable thing for patients as well. The data,
Right.
though, is early there. We're more focused now where, patients are already sick or, just diagnosed or have transitioned through some amount of treatment and need more advanced therapies. So that's what we do at Medzown.
Well, and I think the hope obviously with all of this is that we do catch things sooner and that we
Correct.
eventually figure out how to prevent disease and especially I was talking earlier about cancer in that race against time, but neurodegenerative diseases and some of the other things, there's a lot of chronic disease out there and a lot of people and the thing that we talked on this podcast in past episodes about is just the nature of how it not only affects the patient, obviously, and their quality of life and their life expectancy in some cases, but then also their families around them. And what happens,
Absolutely.
we see, in the environment that we have here in the United States with private and public healthcare, but people launching GoFundMe's because of the financial strain, and just kind of the way that the financial burden of healthcare on the U.S. consumer and U.S. families felt to a certain extent by others around the world as well. But this U.S. healthcare system too, it can literally bankrupt families just trying to find the right treatment. And to your point earlier, I think they could have gone through several treatments before they find the one that is successful, God willing, right? That kind of gets them through it. But all the money has been spent in kind of going and searching for the right thing and kind of the trial and error nature of this whole treatment process.
Absolutely. And, our focus on MedZone is get the patient the right treatment at the right time and create really much more of a financially sustainable system by the way we do that. And I think it's critically important. Again, if you look at, the opportunity for these, so many really interesting and potentially valuable specialty drugs and cell and gene therapies that are in development. There are thousands of them. Some percentage of them will absolutely come to market and have value for many patients, and yet they're going to be very expensive drugs. And so we really have to figure out, number one, how do we get patients access to them more quickly, the right patients access to them more quickly, and do that in a truly financially sustainable.
Yeah, that makes sense. So where do you think we go from here? What does the future look like, right? Like right now you're partnering with some specific plans and that thing. Is there a time in the future where everyone, regardless of insurance, has a benefit of working with MedZone? God forbid they need your services?
Well, that's our vision, Mike, of course.
Of course.
We believe MedZone's the solution.
Yeah, and I think that's the opportunity for the industry, right? So I think for healthcare leaders listening to this today, I think the question is, how do you reduce that swirl in your organization of kind of like how do you partner with patients and their families to help with this matchmaking? And certainly for them to try to do it in-house, what you've spent a good chunk of your career working on and building in kind of the MedZone offering, they some plans may try to do these things in-house with their own people and their own expertise, but partnering with organizations like yours who are really kind of waking up every day thinking about this and helping patients navigate this complex healthcare system and find their way to the right treatment or therapy is really vital. So kudos to you and the team for the work that you're doing.
Thanks so much. It's great work, and we have a fantastic team working on this. Very passionate, very committed to the patients and finding them the right treatments. I couldn't be more honored to be able to work with the people that I work with every day. Very
Yeah,
lucky
that's
for that.
wonderful. Well, Jen, we appreciate the conversation. This was great. For those listening, if you're dealing with kind of those rising costs, complex patient populations, or just trying to figure out how to apply all the innovation that's happening in healthcare today, this is definitely a space worth paying attention to. So thanks for joining us on the Health Tech Edge, and we will see you next time.